Good day to everybody. In order to inaugurate this workshop, apart from the words addressed by the authorities of the NECI and the UNAM who were with us this morning, we chose a presentation by Dr. Geoffrey Hewings, who kindly agreed to be the keynote speaker for today. Perhaps many of you don't know him, and therefore I'm going to talk about his CV. He's asked me to shorten it, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Dr. Hewings is currently the Director of the Regional Economics Application Laboratory in the Urbana campus of the Illinois University. He obtained his BA from the University of Birmingham, UK, and his MA and PhD from the University of Washington in Seattle. And prior to coming to Illinois in 1974, he was on the faculty of the University of Kent at Canterbury, UK, and the University of Toronto in Canada. He has received many awards that we unfortunately don't have the time to mention here. And apart from that, and this is very important for us, he was president of the International Association of Input-Output Analysis in the previous period. He's a fan of the Pumas of the university, the football players here at the university. For all these reasons, it's for me a great honor to introduce Dr. Geoffrey Hewings. With a hand, please.
Thank you very much, Pablo. I'm not sure about the Pumas this year, but that's another story. I'm really very delighted to be here, and in behalf of all the international delegates, I want to thank Pablo very sincerely for organizing this meeting. Organizing a meeting is very, very stressful, and when it comes together, it is truly wonderful, and thank you very much for all your efforts. I also want to welcome you on behalf of the International Input-Output Association. We just concluded a week ago our annual meeting in Kitakyushu in Japan that was very, very successful. And our dream and hope is that in the next 2 years or so, we might be able to come to Mexico to hold such a meeting. And I'm very excited to learn that you have over 100 members of the local input-output group here in Mexico, which is really very, very encouraging. Having said that, I should also make a confession to be somewhat embarrassed by the fact that I have lived now in Illinois for almost 40 years, and I have only come to Mexico 4 times. And I hope over the next 3 or 4 years that will change dramatically. We are already having 2 students from UNAM spend some time with us in Illinois next year, and I hope this is the beginning of some emerging strong relationships with Mexico. We're a little behind the schedule, and one of the advantages of being a Welshman is that we are very flexible, and we can fill whatever time you give me. So I'm going to shorten my presentation a little and just highlight some of the main points, and I think that would be most appropriate. But before I do that, I just want to make one other final comment. In your presence here today are 3 former presidents of the International Input-Output Association, and I think you should regard this as an indication of how much we really want to enhance our relationship with Mexico. Jan Osterhaven, who's sitting in the front, and next to him, Faye Duchin, as well as Pablo indicated, I was the immediate past president. And I think we're very excited by what we see of the possibilities here. In the international conference in Kitakyushu, Richard Baldwin from the Advanced Institute in Geneva referred to input-output specialists now as superstars. That is something that in 40 years of doing input-output analysis, I've never heard before. Usually something less attractive is made comment about people who work in input-output. And I think that we can really thank the World Input-Output Database Group development has really transformed the thinking about input-output analysis, particularly as we look at trade relationships. And I think that the opportunities now for us to understand what is going on inside economies, we begin to realize once again how valuable input-output tables and input-output accounts and input-output models are to help us understand this. And secondly, we're also finding that a lot of international agencies are now understanding that they need to go below the level of the country, that the internal heterogeneity that exists in places like Mexico, in Brazil, the US, and in Europe really needs to be addressed. And what better than to have sets of multi-regional input-output tables to help us with this exercise. So this is, I think, a very interesting time and opportunity for researchers in this field. And I think this meeting will, I hope, be the start of some renewed interest in the world community in what's going on in Mexico. And again, Pablo, thank you very much. So without further ado, let me move to my discussion. I'm going to address a few issues related to the household sector. And in 95% of the presentations I've heard focused on input-output, it's usually addressing what goes on inside the inter-industry part of the matrix. And so I want to draw your attention to something that is just as important, but has often been somewhat neglected in terms of our studies, and that is the household sector. So this is the initial agenda. I'm going to cut out several of these sections. I leave the presentation here. On our website, you'll find most of these papers, and if you're interested, you can read them in more detail. One of the aspects that we have been working on in the last 10 years has been to look at the role of households in multidimensional ways. And increasingly, we focused on issues related to aging of the population. I'll come back to that. But as many of you are aware, in the last decade, income distribution has worsened in terms of standard measures like the Gini coefficient. And we need to understand what are the dynamics around this and what implications does this have. We've also found that as we look at the household sector, consumption patterns are incredibly heterogeneous across age groups, across income groups, and in many cases across location. The other aspect about the households, which makes it much more difficult, much more interesting at the same time, is that they move, and the role of migration turns out to be incredibly critical. For those of you who live in North America, you're very much aware of debates that are going on in Canada, the US, about the role of immigration and the degree to which it is beneficial or not beneficial. And increasingly related to the issue of aging is the whole issue of retirement and the concomitant increase in attention directed to investment in human capital. But if these weren't enough, I think the most important statistic is that in the US, the household consumption accounts for 70% of expenditures on gross product on the expenditure side. Yet most of our models have a representative household. And yet, in our input-output accounts, we have 435 industrial sectors, but one household account. And clearly that imbalance is uncomfortable, and it should make us ask the question, do we need to pay more attention to that household sector? And my response is yes. All right. So what we're looking at in terms of these demographic challenges to development are some of the issues that I put here that I've already addressed. And in particular, there are important public policy issues surrounding funding of pension plans, about appropriate incentives for investment in human capital, that are all very much tied up with these types of approaches. So if you think about the sort of triangle that Eric Thorbecke would present in his social accounting models about how we want to model the interaction between changes in the structure of production, the structure of income, and the structure of consumption, what we want to add are two very important components. One is the role of changes in interregional trade, in particular, how that is moving. And I was very interested to learn this morning at breakfast there's now a major initiative in Mexico to try to develop interregional trade input-output tables for Mexico. And the second part is the one at the bottom that looks at the role of mobility, in and out migration, and differences in regional preferences, how they interact and essentially add additional dimensions to this triangle. And so in our modeling case, this is the sort of process that we've been looking at, how demographic changes are affecting particularly changes in consumption that are affecting changes in one case in our Chicago economy that's also being affected by the role of migration. And so the dynamics surrounding the household sector turn out to be very, very critical. And if you're still not convinced, let me just give you a couple of illustrations. One of the things that we've developed over the last several years is this notion of analytical importance in input-output accounts. And what we basically try to do is find out the subset of coefficients that, if they change, have an above-average impact on outcomes. For example, if we're making forecasts or if we're doing impact analysis. So here's an example from a very old social accounting matrix, just the inter-industry part. It was put together by Pyatt and Rowe a long time ago. And you can see that something of the order of 5 sectors turn out, 5 coefficients rather, turn out to be analytically important. They're really critical. We get them wrong or they change, they have an above average impact on the economy. But now if we put that input-output set of accounts inside a more extensive social accounting system, we find that what is analytically important changes, so that the input-output part in the lower right-hand corner, only 2 coefficients turn out to be important. But the circled areas are the receipts of income by households, and the vertical line is the consumption by households. Those turn out to be the most critical. If we get those wrong, we find significant differences in our forecast of impacts, or if we're using this in a forecasting context in terms of forecasting of outcomes on our economy. So one of the things that I think is very important for us to understand is that we need to be paying a little bit more attention to this and move just beyond considerations of income distribution to include the things that I mentioned earlier, the effects of aging and migration. And one of the reasons why it's important for us to understand is that demographic processes have both a short-term and a long-term impact. Short-term impact occurs when you have instantaneous migration. When new migrants come in, usually they want to enter the labor force, and so they have an instantaneous impact upon the economy. The longer-term impact of demographic processes comes through natural increases, through the standard demographic accounting as a result of births and deaths. And increasingly in multi-racial economies like the US, this turns out to have important dynamics. So for example, in the Chicago region, right now, 13% of the 9 million people in the metropolitan area are of Latino origin. By 2030, they will account for 37% of the population. That's enormous changes. What sort of economic consequences will that have? We're beginning to explore those. But the other dimension, I think, which is equally important, is the whole process of aging of the economy. And most countries have a similar growth path that looks like this. So we've moved from around 3 or 4% of our population in 1900 that was over 65 years of age to an expectation that by 2030, somewhere between 20 and 30% of our population will be over 65. And in a place like China, that represents about 300 million people. All right? That's an enormous percentage of the population who are unlikely to be involved in the labor force, but are going to be there demanding goods and services and spending money. So I think the imperative that we are beginning to see is a dramatic need to pay more attention to what's going on in our household sector. And one of the dimensions, just as illustration for Illinois, if you look at the bottom left-hand side of the chart, that you'll notice that between now and 2030, we're going to lose 1/3 of a million people in the 25 to 44-year age group, but we're going to gain almost 1 million people over 65. And so that's going to have some important implications. So our initial explorations were to link our econometric input-output model with a modified AIDS model, almost ideal demand system, initially developed from some of Stone's ideas by Angus Deaton and Muhlbauer in the 1980s. And I'm, in the interest of time, going to jump over the mathematics and go to some of the outcomes. Does it make any difference whether we use a representative household or we disaggregate the household? What this graph shows is that there are enormous variations in the growth rates of consumption by households of different age. And you can see that the growth rates between now and 2030 of older households, those are 55 to 65 and 65 and older, are of the order of 30 to 40%, while the younger households are declining by 5 to 10%. The representative household shows a growth rate of about 8 or 9%. So we have enormous variation in the growth rates. And it turns out that's important because there are differences in consumption by age. Not dramatically different, but they are still significant. This is from some data from Japan where we have cohorts of different age going back to the 1940s through to the present time. And you can see across the horizontal axis that age groups spend different shares of their income on food, on housing, on clothing, on healthcare, and on transportation. These are just some samples. And so as the population ages and the mix changes, there's likely to be a very, very significant impact on consumption. And we haven't really addressed that profoundly. And what is interesting here is a lot of businesses are getting very concerned that they are not taking into account that 20 to 25% of the population is likely to be over 65. Are they thinking about what types of goods and services they're going to need? What type of housing that they're going to require? What types of demands for transportation are they going to require? So this is one thing that's interesting. And just out of interest, I'll use this as an example. I was very excited when I saw our forecasts because it showed that food consumption between 2003 and 2030, particularly for our older age group, was going to decline. And I thought, this is very good news because in the US, 35% of the population is obese. And I thought, finally, maybe we're addressing this problem. Sadly, this is food that people buy in the supermarket and go home and prepare. Usually healthier, all right? Instead, people are spending more money at the restaurant, McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken. So unfortunately, we're not very optimistic about whether our aging population is going to be a healthier population. But it's certainly interesting to note as you look at this table how there are significant differences for some types of consumption. And the other aspect of this is the type of consumption. For example, housing is going to be different as people age. And that's something we want to look at more carefully. All right. So when we put this all together, one of the unexpected outcomes was that as a result of this aging process, income inequality was going to increase very dramatically in the Chicago region. And that was because we were going to have growth rates of the richer populations, those employed in more high-rewarding, skilled jobs, was going to grow more rapidly than low-income jobs. And one of the concerns is that, is this something that we need to think about in terms of appropriate policy intervention? And that's something we will address in a couple of our papers. More generally, we've approached this problem, and I'm going to spend just 5 more minutes going through this, looking at aging and the macroeconomy, looking at ways to integrate overlapping generations models inside our CGE-type models that we have developed. And one of the advantages of that is that we have 2 versions, one of which we refer to as a Marshallian model, where essentially commodities or goods change and clear the markets, and we do that through changes in the input-output coefficients. The other one is a standard Walrasian model, where prices change to clear markets. And we consider only the behavior of households between 21 and 85, and why 85? That's my target year. But as I get older, I'm pushing that back. So maybe it'll be 90 or 100. And on my way into Chicago this week, there was a sign that said 1 out of every 3 babies born this year can be expected to live to 100. You know, that's an amazing thought when you think about the demographic challenges for us. So one of the advantages of this type of framework is we look at the world in an intertemporal context, and I think that increasingly important. And in particular, what we're trying to do is try to model how people should be a little bit forward-looking, not to say that they are. So essentially, we think about how an individual considers consumption today as opposed to putting money in either the stock market or a pension fund to consume later, after they stop working. And then the other choice they have to make is whether they buy local goods or whether they buy imported goods. And so the whole process involves a great deal of complication. And as we add endogenous investment in human capital in subsequent work, the individual has to decide how many years and when to invest in education in the hope of gaining a higher rate of return over his or her lifetime. That then becomes a much more complicated problem. So that's basically the issue. We assume people enter the labor force at age 21 and they retire without any option in this model at age 65. They then draw down their assets until they're 85, in which they die. And I showed this model to my kids and said to them, this is my objective function, and see how much you're going to get when I depart. 0. They were not very happy about this. But they said, but didn't you have some unexpected bequests in the event that you die earlier? Yes. So I'm very, very careful about what my kids feed me now, because I'm worried that they may be thinking about this particular model. So essentially, what we assume is the sort of standard hum-shaped profile, which I absolutely don't believe, because this assumes that our productivity is maximized somewhere in our early 50s, and then we have declining productivity. And I just look around this room, and I know there are a lot of people over 55 who are more productive now than they were in their 40s. The question is, why do we have to accept this? And unfortunately, a lot of the models do. I think we need to challenge that. So essentially what we assume is that in the early years, wage income accounts for almost all our income, and then as we get older, we have a little bit more income from our assets. Finally, when we retire, our wage income goes to 0, we draw down our asset income, and we have our pension income to sustain us until we depart. What happens when we have an aging population? A couple of interesting things. We have a decrease in total income. This is assuming no in-migration, no out-migration. A decrease in total income, and that occurs because of a rise in Social Security costs. Consumption also declines because people are very concerned about saving enough money for their retirement. But once they retire, the change in income is very, very small. One of the most important macro consequences of aging was the decline in gross regional product. And this was not surprising given the fact you had fewer people in the labor force, a higher dependency ratio, and so on. What happens when we have immigration? And this is what I'm going to finish with, because this is right now one of the hottest debates in the US. And what I've got here are the sort of standardized, stylized facts, both for and against immigration. The right wing, for the most part in the US, feels that immigrants crowd out local workers. The empirical evidence for this is non-existent. It doesn't happen. They feel there will be a reduction in wages because they come in, they expand the labor force, classical labor force operations work, but the labor market is very segmented by skills. And that's something that does not necessarily happen. And you could get higher income disparities. That may be the case, but it's not very clear. On the positive side, immigration may change the age structure. And essentially by counteracting some of the negative effects of aging. And when we look at Japan and compare it with the US, where Japan has very, very limited in-migration, it's very, very clear that the impacts are different as a result of this. And furthermore, if the immigrants come in and they're legal, very important that they're legal, and they pay taxes, they're going to be contributing to the Social Security system. And that will turn out to be very, very important in the long run. So when we look at this, we try to figure out for our Chicago economy what would happen if we increase the number of immigrants by making it more attractive to come to Chicago. And what happened is, under an aging scenario, we'd have a dependency ratio which would be 32%. That's each person in the labor force would be supporting 3 or 4 people not in the labor force. But in the most optimistic scenario, we would return the dependency ratio to the 2005 level. So it turned out to be very, very important. Yes, it had a negative impact in the short run on wages, but in the longer run, wages began to rise again. It had a positive impact on gross regional product. More increments we had coming in, the higher the rate of return. And on per capita gross regional product, there was an initial short-run decline, but then it started to rise again. And so I think the answer for all of this comes in perhaps the interesting aspect that it is true that we would expect an increase in the Gini, because we're essentially having more low-income, low-skill immigrants coming in, and as a result, we can expect, at least in the short run, an increase in income inequality. So those are some of the thoughts we have, and there's a lot of other stuff, and I'm not going to go onto it. I'll go to the conclusions. I think that as we model these demographic processes, we have to be very mindful of some of the limitations of these models. Most of them require perfect rationality and foresight. And just looking around at a number of my colleagues, and I'm sure your colleagues, that's not a characteristic of a large percentage of our population. People are not planning for retirement. And one of the things that we're seeing right now is a lot of people who've retired re-entering the labor force because they don't have enough assets. So thinking about that issue really requires us to be much more flexible in our modeling that we haven't already. Second thing is we may need to think about ways to encourage workers to invest and reinvest in their human capital, not just when they're in their 20s, but somewhat later in their career. Robert Reich, the former Secretary of Labor under President Clinton, noted that people may have to be trained and retrained up to 6 times during a career. We don't have facilities or organizations that are that flexible, but we may need to think about that. And we haven't thought about the dynamics of the economy in the terms of new goods and services that will be entered and where they will be produced. And so these are things that we're looking at. And finally, we're looking at a whole lot of other issues about as people re-enter the labor force, do they go back to places where they formerly worked, or do they stay where they have retired? And there are a number of papers on our website that you can look at. My main goal was to try to get you to think about the demographic part of your models and not get absolutely fixated on the inter-industry part. It's just one component and it needs more work. Thank you very much, Bob.
¿Alguna pregunta? Some question? Christian?
That you changed between individuals and households, agents and families. And that reminds me on a talk which I had with Feducin I think it was in the 80s when I visited her in New York. We had the same problem because households consume, households determine the consumption patterns, the saving pattern, but individuals earn. So how to treat the household sector, how to disaggregate it into types of households or into types of individuals. And our conclusion at that time was that we should do both. We should disaggregate the income sector by individuals and the household sector and the consumption sector by households, and then bridge those two things by bridge metrics. And the other thing is you draw a lot of intention towards the different consumption patterns of different types of households or individuals. I think much more important is the saving pattern. That's it.
Thank you, Christian, for your good questions. Yeah, we are spending a lot of time right now doing what we call propensity matching, using some of Heckman's ideas to going from the individual to the household. And so most of our work is at the household level, but it's informed, if you like, with micro foundations from the individual. And that makes the accounting a lot easier rather than trying to have both things in one accounting framework. The other aspect, you're absolutely right, and in effect, as we model the consumption patterns, we're implicitly also modeling one minus the consumption, which is the savings rates, so that we are getting at that indirectly. In one of the papers, we have looked at changes in savings rates by age group and so forth. But those data are much, much more difficult to get. And in particular, the type of instruments that people are saving. Is it they're putting it in a bank, or are they investing in the stock market or in some defined pension plan? All of those things are an accounting nightmare because we don't know where they're located and we don't know where the economic impacts are likely to be. But they are really, really critical. Thank you for your questions.
¿Otra pregunta?